Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
So the title of my talk is Natural Game Design, Creating Games Without Cloning. Because in a way, it's hard both from a design perspective and from a business perspective not to do this. From a design perspective, my basic impression of game designers in the industry is that many of them are not exactly secure in their craft, and that as with young artists of all all types, anyone begins by copying what other people do. And unfortunately, the natural tendency from a business perspective is to keep doing that. Because as markets mature, they become increasingly conservative. The cost of development always increases in any new game medium. And as costs increase, business people become much more risk averse, and they try to squish out any possibility of design risk. This is, of course, foolish. Because cloning is fundamentally a mug's game. If you are launching a title into the market that is essentially highly imitative of existing successful products in the market, particularly in a free-to-play environment, you are facing major issues because the market leader has much better data than you do. They have tuned their game to a fare thee well. They have a higher long-time value than you will at launch because they have tuned their game to a fare thee well. And you're competing for essentially the same player base and paying sky-high user acquisition costs because you're in direct competition with the market leader. It's just why anyone does this is beyond me. This is a quote I love. Dan Scherlis used to be CEO of Turbine Entertainment. Genre is the name we give to one hit game and its imitators. That is, this is not true in other fields, but it does seem to be true in the games industry. But the games that create genres, the games that combine and create novel play patterns tend to be huge hits. Not invariably, like I did not include Doom 2 on my slide here, because although it was highly innovative and created the real-time strategy genre, it itself was not a huge hit. But back into the prehistory, back into the ages, the era of tabletop role-playing, Dungeons & Dragons was a game like nothing anyone had ever seen before. So was SimCity, so was Doom, Civilization. And the same thing is kind of true today. A game like Portal or even Clash of Clans, I'm not saying that any of these games were completely startlingly original, but they combined play patterns in a way that no one had really seen before. So if you look at it from that perspective, innovative design is certainly high risk, but it's also high potential reward. And particularly if, say, you're running a startup, that sounds like a tasty combination of risk and reward to bite off. But as a game designer, the usual things that we do in our day-to-day life do not lend themselves to innovation. We sit around and we twiddle numbers in spreadsheets and we document stuff and we iteratively refine, but we're not doing anything that is kind of blue sky, whole cloth innovation. We are just doing the kind of day-to-day tasks that we're used to doing, and it's important to try to get out of that mindset and do something different. So in preparation for this talk, I was thinking of, what kind of methodologies can we adopt for kind of blue ocean innovation? Are there ways of organizing this process? And I came up with 3 that I have either used myself or that I have observed other people doing. And I'll start with the first one, which is what I call Agile Design. Now, in the games industry, we pretend that we are doing Agile game development. We have stand-ups and we have meetings and we ask people to commit to their tasks and all this kind of thing. But in fact, 90% of the time, what we are doing is we are developing a game to a set budget and a set time frame, and we have a spec that we're asking our engineers to implement. So in fact, what we're doing is waterfall development with a little bit of Agile sprinkled on top. But what if we looked at this and we said, let's try to do game design, not engineering, but game design from an Agile perspective. And if we do that, what we come up with looks something like this. You take a very small team, 1 designer, 1 engineer, maybe some art support, and you tell them, come up with an interesting core mechanic, and you prototype it, and you test it, and if it doesn't work, you throw it out, and you start over again, right? You don't stick with something that's not working. But if you prototype it and you look at it and you say, oh, this has some potential, then of course you iterate on it and iterate on it until you get to something and you can say, this is fun. We have found the fun here. And then you go on to stage 2, which is not full-scale development. Because many times I think you will find that once you have that kind of interesting novel core mechanic, you will also discover that the possibility space that it opens up is too constrained to support a full-scale development. So you need to do things like, well, what if we have these power-ups, does that lend itself to the development of 60 different levels? What can we do to kind of complexify our initial core mechanic to create something that actually can support a game that people will want to play for 6 months, or a game that people will want to pay $3 or $20 or $50 for. So you keep on, maybe you scale up a little bit, you have a little bit of a larger team here, have some actual, something other than engineering art. But you keep on iterating that until you can look at it and say, yes, we have the vision, we can see how this can become a blockbuster, and we know exactly what we need to be doing at this point. And that, of course, is when you staff up, you do your planning and pre-production, and you plunge into full development. So the point here is, yeah, you're biting off design risk, but you're doing it with a relatively small team at first, and you're iterating until you get somewhere, and there are some basic rules you need to follow. Tiny team, of course. Also, those first 2 stages, they take as long as they take. You do not time box them, do not constrain them, and particularly be willing to throw away your work if things are not working, and don't gear up until you find the fun. I will say, if it's taking 6 months and your team still hasn't found something interesting, then probably you need a different team, right? But yeah. Okay, so this seems to be kind of how that game company and Spryfox work, both excellent operations. The DOTS people, I think, also kind of work this way. As with any methodology, there are advantages and disadvantages. Firstly, this is likely to work best for mechanically relatively simple games because you're kind of iterating on one core mechanic there. Like just about everything that succeeds in the casual market. Also, of course, there is no guarantee of success, but then nothing guarantees success, ever. Okay, so that was my first approach to coming up with a methodology for innovative game design. This is another one. This is what I call recombinant game design patterns. The idea of design patterns comes out of the architecture world initially, but it has been adopted to software engineering. And a few years ago, Bernd Kreimeyer came up with the idea of trying to adopt it to game design as opposed to actual engineering. And this is his definition of patterns. Patterns are simply conventions for describing and documenting recurring game design decisions within a given context, be it game design or software engineering. And yes, there is a book, this Patterns in Game Design. This book, from my perspective, should be in every game designer's library. It is incredibly dry and boring. But basically, Staffan Bjork and Jussi Holopainen went out and exhaustively documented essentially all of the game design patterns they could find in both digital and non-digital games. In fact, the book is really only about a third of what their actual work is. The rest comes in a CD-ROM that comes with the book. And if you look at it, essentially a pattern is a collection of mechanics and UI expressions and visual expressions that together make for a kind of building block of a game. Jussi Holopainen, who's one of the co-authors, was my boss when I worked for Nokia. So, games in a genre. If we look at games in a genre, it's astonishing how little they vary. They vary in theme and detail, of course, but in almost every case, every game uses exactly the same play patterns with almost never any deviation. Here's an example. If you look at real-time strategy games, they all have fog of war, they all have resource gathering, they all have building and unit construction, they all have 2 or more races or civilizations or whatever with asymmetric capabilities and different dominant strategies. The early game is a build-up and the end game is a battle, and at least in the multiplayer version of the game, speed and interface mastery is the key to victory. I don't think you can find a real-time strategy game where any of this is not true. So one easy way to innovate is by taking play patterns that haven't been used together before and figuring out how to meld them. Right? Here is an example. Spelunky is an indie game, very successful. It's a platformer, and traditionally, platformers are extraordinarily heavily designed games where the level is carefully planned out and tested to fare thee well, and there is never any deviation within that level. Spelunky, the levels are algorithmically generated. They're random. So essentially, he's taking Mario Brothers and Rogue and munging them together. And it's amazing that it works at all, and Derek Yu, the developer, had to spend a lot of time tweaking it in order to get it to the point where it really is playable, and you almost never feel, as you do in Rogue, that you're screwed just because of the randomness of the level generation. And of course, one of the advantages is that unlike a game like Mario Brothers, where you play through it and you're done, it has infinite replayability because the levels are different every time. Here's another example. Portal is a first-person shooter, right? Well, no, obviously not. It uses a first-person shooter engine, but really what it is, it's a game of navigation puzzles. So the developers of Portal are taking existing building blocks that we know work for other games. They're taking a first-person shooter engine, they're taking navigation puzzles, they're taking physics, and they're just putting it together in a way that no one had ever seen before and creating something astonishing. Minecraft is another example. There's no element of Minecraft that itself is particularly novel. It's a sandbox world construction game. We've seen that before. It has survival horror elements. We've seen that before. It has crafting. We've seen that before. But we have not seen is the way is putting those together to create this highly novel product. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to any methodology. One of the advantages here is we are starting with proven mechanics. We know that these things work in some context. It may not work in our context, but it's worth maybe experimenting there. And of course, not everything works with everything else. If you took Bjork and Lepinen's book and flipped it open and chose 3 mechanics at random, you might look at it and say, this would be a total mess. There's no way I can make a game out of it. On the other hand, you might look at it and say, how would I do that? And you know, that kind of what if is the start of an interesting game design project. This is, of course, less kind of whole cloth innovation than the more agile approach, but probably more suited to more complicated games like, say, the Midcore. My current game, basically, I'm trying to do this, by the way. It's Clash of Clans-like, but no timers, and we're figuring out another way to spin out the gameplay for the necessary amount of time. And actually spin out gameplay in a way that engages players rather than making them twiddle their thumbs for 8 days until their project completes. And the third approach that I have noticed, and in fact used myself, is what I call trope inversion. And the idea here is you take an existing genre that is well understood and well known, and you look at the conventional wisdom behind it, and you say, why does it have to be that way? I'm going to take this one thing and I'm going to totally turn it on its head and do the exact opposite. And I did this in a game published back in the 80s called Paranoia. Paranoia is a tabletop role-playing game, and if you've ever played D&D, you know that one of the basic things about a tabletop role-playing game is all the players have to cooperate, and the opposition is provided by NPCs that the games master kind of runs. And internal party conflict is always bad. It leads to hard feelings, and things fall apart. So player cooperation is essential in a tabletop role-playing game. So I will now read from the back cover here a little bit. Paranoia, a lighthearted game of terror, death, bureaucracies, mad scientists, mutants, dangerous weapons, and insane robots, which encourages players to backstab each other at every opportunity, cheat and backstab each other at every opportunity. So in other words, you are taking one of the basic things that everyone knows to be true about tabletop role-playing game and turning it on its head. Paranoia has been in print for 30 years and has sold more than 400,000 copies worldwide. Here's another example, Realm of the Mad God, Spry Fox game. One of the basic conventional wisdoms about MMOs is permadeath is bad. Permadeath makes people rage quit. Permadeath, you just do not want to do that. And in fact, if you look at the evolution of MMOs over the years, the penalties for death have kind of been nerfed and nerfed and nerfed and nerfed until they almost don't exist anymore. Realm of the Mad God, you die, you start over. It is a game built around permadeath. Now, of course, you also can level up relatively quickly, and there's a 20-level cap. One of the other ways it inverts MMOs is the game ends. The basic idea behind both MMOs and most free-to-play games is our game's never ending, they go on forever, we want to keep on taking your money, we never end the game, which is, from a game design perspective, kind of idiotic, really, because you lose so much by not having a game come to completion and having winners and losers. You're losing a lot of the potential game design tricks that can make games interesting by saying it has to go on forever. But that's the business constraint that we operate under, except that Realm of the Bad God, the game ends. The big bad guy shows up, there's a boss battle, everyone in the world has to participate pretty much in order to succeed, and win or lose, the game ends, and then that starts over. Now there is a little bit of persistence, not of your character, but of some of the things that you have unlocked over the course of play, so there is a reason to want to sign up again and continue, but again, kind of a really imaginative and interesting approach to design. So what's the advantages and the disadvantages of this method? Well, for one thing, it's so simple. All you have to do is take an existing genre and change one thing. And you know that everything else about the genre works, but you just have to figure out how to change that one thing and make that work. Of course, the downside is that conventional wisdom exists for a reason. I mean, permadeath is a bad thing in MMOs, and figuring out how to do a game where permadeath is part of the design is non-trivial. And of course, as with any methodology, you can totally fail. So what I'm asking you as designers is to get out of your rut. Yes, making games is hard, even without innovation, and yes, innovation is hard as well, but it's not that hard. There are proven ways to go about this and to think about it, and just don't make another clone. You know, do something a little different. Just do it. Of course, game designers and suits are inherently class enemies, since we want to be creative and they want to minimize design risk. So sadly, you may never get a chance to do anything in your career that is worth the powder to blow it to hell. And that's sad, but welcome to the games industry.